This is Cairo, Illinois, abandoned and forgotten. Unfortunately, a lot of towns in America drop in population and become mostly vacant. Most of these towns dying is due to a decrease in a specific industry that the towns heavily relied on. Well-known examples of this are Detroit in the auto industry or Gary, Indiana in the steel industry. But this is certainly not the case for the town of Cairo, Illinois. Today, this town is extremely close to being totally abandoned. Over the years, this town has lost about 89% of its population. Most of the buildings are completely abandoned. The majority of the town hasn't seen much life since the 1960s. This former bustling little town has a much darker past than similar towns that are now abandoned. In the early 1900s, Cairo was thriving. They had reached the height of their population at around 15,000 people. However, they ran into some issues with their main industry. They used to transport railroad cars across the Mississippi and Ohio River by use of ferry boats. This was done because there was no railroad bridge, but in 1905, one was built that diverted most of the traffic away from Cairo. Throughout the history of Cairo, they've had some issues with industry and have struggled with having enough good jobs for the residents. But in this video, we'll be focusing on the racist past of this town that we believe was definitely a factor in the downfall of this town. We're not saying this is the only factor, but definitely a notable one that deserves its own video. In November of 1909, a black man by the name of Will James was accused of murdering a 22-year-old white shopkeeper by the name of Anna Pelly. Even though there was no physical proof that he did it, the word of the supposed crime spread quickly. Whites in Cairo demanded that James be tried right away. The local sheriff was aware of this and feared that a mob would take things into their own hands, so he quickly took Will James and boarded a train, attempting to get away from the angry townspeople. Unfortunately, the townspeople quickly found them. The angry crowd took James away from the sheriff and brought him back to Cairo. Then he was taken to the town square at 8th and Commercial Street to be hanged in front of thousands of people. They attempted to hang him from the arches that were over the main town square seen in this photo. But the rope broke. James dropped to the ground, still alive. The mob then reportedly shot him over 500 times. Will James supposedly had an accomplice, and the violent crowd tried to find him so they could kill him as well. However, they weren't able to locate him. The bloodthirsty mob instead then turned its aggression towards a white prisoner that had murdered his wife a few months earlier. They broke into the prison and lynched this man as well. You might hope after a chaotic event like this that the town might remember how awful it was and not repeat it. But of course, that's not the case. Less than a year later, in 1910, another mob tried to lynch a black man who was accused of stealing a white woman's purse. This time, they killed a sheriff's deputy in the process. The National Guard was called in and martial law was declared until order could be restored. Through the years, the racial tension definitely still lingered on. However, the town did see some financial success. Of course, the town would be hit hard years later by events such as the Great Depression and, of course, World War I and II. By the 1960s, the town's population was only around 9,000 people. Even though the notorious lynching had happened 50 years prior, the town was still vastly segregated and hardened by the awful events of the past. In the 60s, most of the good city jobs were unfairly given to the white residents, and the black residents were unfairly treated by white police officers. The city's facilities, including public housing, municipal parks, and courtroom seatings, were totally segregated. Almost all public and private offices only employed white people. During this time, the public swimming pool was transformed into a private club in order to keep the black community out. A large number of civil rights activists demonstrated at the pool in 1962. At one of the protests, a white racist local intentionally drove his pickup truck into the crowd, badly wounding a young African-American girl. The pool would eventually close in order to avoid integration. All of these things that were happening were awful, but something happened in 1967 that was just too far, and the black residents would not stand for it. In July of 1967, a 19-year-old black soldier home on leave named Robert Hunt was found dead in the Cairo police station. Police said that Hunt had killed himself by hanging himself with his t-shirt, but many people in Cairo's black community blamed the police for his death. There was a history of police bias and violence against black people in the city. Members of the black community, led by Reverend Charles Cohen, a native of Cairo, began to protest both Hunt's death and a century of harsh segregation. This led to racial riots all throughout the city. In response, some white townspeople made a vigilante group. The group became known as the White Hats because many of its 600 members started wearing white construction hats to show they were members while patrolling the streets to keep order. And the chief of police actually gave these men power, so what they were doing was technically legal. But of course, the White Hats abused said power to further bully and mistreat the black population. 1969 saw the establishment of the United Front of Cairo by the black population as a countermeasure to the White Hats. The coalition's retaliation sparked an intensified civil rights struggle to remove segregation and establish employment possibilities. Black residents were assisted by important figures from outside the community. One of the most well-known figures was Reverend Jesse Jackson. The United Front formally accused the White Hats of intimidating the black population and presented the city of Cairo with a list of requests. Some of the demands included the hiring of a black police chief and an equal number of black and white employees in all city positions. Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon and a special committee created by the Illinois House of Representatives began investigating the events of Cairo in April 1969. The Illinois General Assembly quickly disbanded the White Hats and demanded for the implementation of civil rights laws as well as the racial integration of city and county administrations. You might think that this plan implemented by the governor may have helped, but at this point it was already too late. Even after this, large groups of white townspeople gathered frequently, and the sentiment on both sides remained hostile. In December of 1969, there was another rise in the level of violence, and on December 6, a number of establishments were set on fire. While responding to one of the fierce fires, members of the Pyramid Courts housing project opened fire on 3 firefighters and the chief of police early that morning. The victims were struck by bullets. During the exchange of gunfire, both the chief of police and a member of the fire department were injured by shots fired from a high-powered weapon. The Cairo chief of police resigned the following month, stating that Cairo lacked both the legal and physical means to deal with the guerrilla warfare tactics that had left the town in a state of turmoil for over 2 years. And in the end, 13 people were arrested as a result of the conflict. The conflict resulted in the town being in a state of turmoil. The black community and the United Front started boycotting all white racist businesses, which was most of them. African Americans continued to picket businesses all through 1970 to make sure that the boycott was followed. The city passed a new law in December that makes it illegal to picket within 20 feet of a business. Because of the city law, there was another big, violent fight. After the violence, the United Front called for another big rally and went back to picketing businesses owned by white people, even though there was a new law against it. Violence and protests continued into the 1970s, with more than 150 nights of gunfire, dozens of marches, protests, and arrests, and many businesses being bombed or going out of business. The hate and violence caused by racism and the unwillingness to treat the black community fairly literally destroyed the town. In the early 60s, the town had a population of over 9,300, and by the early 70s, the population had plummeted to a little over 6,000. Such a rapid decline in population that was solely caused by racism has never really happened to this extreme, at least to my knowledge. Today, Commercial Avenue, the main street in the town of Cairo, is completely vacant, void of life. It's hard to imagine that this street once was the main gathering and shopping location for over 15,000 people. The street was lined with all sorts of family-owned businesses. Just look at this amazing gym theater that was filled with families watching films, and now it's completely destroyed and forgotten. The inside is completely gutted and covered in graffiti. It's just really sad to see. The town was thriving and honestly had a pretty good location, positioned right between the Ohio and Mississippi River. Who knows where the town would be today if it wasn't for the terrible treatment of black members of the community. Cairo had a lot of potential, and it's unfortunate to see the end result that all this hate and anger had. Today, the population is only around 1,600, and the average household income in Cairo, Illinois is only $27,600, and over a third of the population here live in poverty. The average home price is shockingly low at just $35,000. Comparatively, Chicago, Illinois' average house price is $350,000, 10 times the amount of an average home in Cairo. In the past decade, there have been attempts to revive the city through tourism. Although somewhat negative, the town is full of history and was a battleground for the civil rights movement. The town is still full of historic, beautiful buildings and spectacular views of the rivers. There's just simply not enough money to help with the attempted rebirth of this town. As Carson states, the community is unfortunately dying. They are yet to find said solution to helping this city recover.
As I've said before, we've examined virtually every option that there is. This, unfortunately, is a dying community. People don't have jobs there. There's really no support for public-private partnerships, and you have a housing development that, through years of neglect, has deteriorated into an unlivable atmosphere.
Hopefully we can learn something from the terrible, hateful past of this now forgotten, lonely town. And I really do hope, for the sake of the community still living there, that this town can bounce back. But the future does not seem bright.